So I am Samantha Davis. I use she, they pronouns, and I am with Black Swan Academy.
Oh. I can't tell. Sultan, are you trying to speak? Can't hear you.
Oh, I also had the phone muted. There we go. This is Sultan, he, him pronouns, and I'm with SMAW, which is an LGBTQ youth organization here in DC.
Hi, my name is Nike Savane, and I am an attorney for foster youth in DC out of Children's Law Center. Oh, and I use she, her pronouns.
Hello, everyone. My name is LaShonda Hill. I use she, her pronouns. I apologize for not having video, but my internet in my mother's home is not great. So the best way for me to be heard is to not use video. So I apologize. But I am Executive Director of the Office for Students in the Care of Youth. And I'm serving on the commission in my personal capacity.
Hi, good evening. I am Emily Gunston. I use she, her pronouns. I'm with the Office of the Attorney General, the DC Office of the Attorney General.
Oh, Christy, you gonna go?
Yeah, I guess Ron wants to go last. I'm Christy Lopez. I use she, her pronouns. I am at Georgetown Law School. Thank you.
And my name is Ronald Hampton, and I'm a retired law enforcement person, former executive director of the National Black Police Association.
Okay. And my name is Blaine Stum. I am a legislative policy advisor to the chairman, currently providing support to the commission, and I use he, him pronouns. All right, did we want to go to review of committee goals? Let me pull up really quick and see if I can share my screen here. Does everybody see the PDF on screen? Good, okay.
Yes.
Good, good. All right, so I'm gonna scroll down here and highlight just so we can get an idea of what the committee is supposed to be looking at. You can kind of read it for yourself, but the role of sworn in special police officers in district schools, preventing violence and or supporting healthy, successful students through non-police supports in schools, alternatives to police responses to incidents, conflict resolution and restorative justice, and then the use of certain police practices as they pertain to youth specifically. Christy, I didn't know if you wanted to provide any context to any of that or sort of what your thinking was.
I think only that, I think I said this before, but the numbers after that are, they go to the provisions of the legislation. So that's where those came from. They weren't, that list is not meant to constrain what the committee considers. It was just the things that are included in the legislation. And the reason why I thought it was, one of the reasons I thought it was worth pulling those out is to remind people that the legislation is temporary, and one of the things that this commission should do is make recommendations about which provisions of this legislation should continue, which should be modified, et cetera.
Does anybody have any questions or thoughts about the committee charge before we move on?
I just want to be clear that alternatives to police responses and conflict resolution both are as it pertains to youth. Right, or no?
Correct. Yeah, that's my understanding anyway.
Yeah.
Oh, Christy, were you gonna?
I was just because I don't remember without looking back at the provisions whether they specifically say youth, but even if they don't, clearly we have to look at them. This committee has to look at them as they pertain for youth. There might be other committees that are looking at them more broadly. I just don't remember. But yeah, we should be looking at them. This committee should be looking at them specifically as it pertains to youth.
Ron, did you have something you wanted to?
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate the request or the conversation that I had with you regarding what DCPS's plans are. I just think we ought to know what's in the plans, and it probably will influence what we're going to do or not. But the fact of the matter is that they're planning to reimagine what security guards do, and I just think we ought to be involved in that process, or at least hear what it is that they're going to do, because they plan to. They haven't released any information. They're in the process of talking about that.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
My understanding, however, is that their scope is only traditional security guards, not school resource officers or special police officers.
No, I know it. I know that. I know that. Yeah, I know. But I just think that we ought to be looking at what it is that they're going to do, and I would hope that they're going to use them as a resource in terms of working with children and doing jobs that some of them already do in the schools. They just would be doing it without uniforms. But I thought that was also something that we ought to have a voice in. That's all.
Yeah, definitely. And just for folks who aren't aware, the council in their Budget Support Act for fiscal year 21 made a switch to who administers and oversees the school security contract. Up until October 1st, it was the Metropolitan Police Department, and it had been there since 2006, I believe. And now it'll be under DCPS. And so I do think it would be worthwhile for some folks for DCPS to come talk to the committee about what it is they plan on doing in terms of the contract and how they see the role of security, what that looks like. Because to Samantha's point, they may be thinking about it very narrowly too. And it would be good to get a sense, not just of what they're doing with the contract, but how they think of security more holistically. Any other comments? Not hearing any. All right, I'm going to stop the screen share. The next item we talked about doing was the selection of co-chairs. I think there was some discussion of this in the email threads, but I don't know that we came to a final decision. So I want to give folks some time to discuss who they think they would like to have be co-chairs of this committee, and I'll open it up. So whoever wants to volunteer or volunteer someone else.
Could I volunteer this for process? Were there still 3 people interested, or were there only 2? Are there still 3?
So technically, but not. So just to make sure everyone was following the email chain, LaShonda, I believe LaShonda, Ron, and I all said that we would be willing and able to be the co-chairs of this committee. I did volunteer, not seeing that there were already 2 people who volunteered, so I would be happy to support Ron and LaShonda in that role, or step in that role if others feel differently.
I was willing, this is Ron, I was willing to step back because I know the work that LaShonda, Samantha have done around the issue of policing in schools and in the history of that work. So I would support you and LaShonda in terms of that position. So I don't have any issues with that.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Ron.
Oh, and this is LaShonda. Yeah, I responded to the thread. I'm happy to have, Samantha and Ron serve as co-leads. I'm also happy to serve with Samantha. So I am amenable and flexible to whatever the group wants to do.
So as somebody who has not volunteered to run this committee, I just wanted to say LaShonda has put in a lot of work trying to organize this meeting, and I know that's a huge part of leadership, and both you and Samantha have so much experience working specifically with youth. I would like to second your co-lead nomination.
Well, you don't have to do that because I'm withdrawing my name.
No, Ron, I didn't mean it that way. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. I'm fine with that. No, I have no issue with that. I respect both of them and the work that they've been doing, and as well as know about the work too. So I don't have a problem with that. So I'm just withdrawing my name. I don't think we ought to have no elections and selection and all that stuff. Let's just do it.
Well, Ron, I like that energy. I'm down.
Second, I'm here for that. I appreciate y'all.
It's a worker.
And I'll say thank you to LaShonda, Ron, and Samantha. Thank you, all three of you, for stepping up and then deciding to resolve this.
All right, so it sounds like Samantha and LaShonda, thank you. Appreciate your leadership here. Samantha, I didn't know if you wanted to intro the advancement project folks or how you wanted to proceed there, so.
Sure, I can do that. So want to make sure Maria is on. Yes, I see her name. Great. So again, I'm Samantha Davis. I use she, they pronouns with Black Swan Academy. Black Swan Academy has been supporting Black youth and youth of color in DC and the demand for police-free schools. That demand has been one that we have been working towards for the past 2 years, that started really with a really intentional demand of investments for all things that create a healthy, safer, more equitable learning environment for young people, and a divestment in all forms of policing and criminalization. And then over the past year, we have doubled down on our demand and made an explicit call for the removal of all police from schools, DCPS, and charters. That work is not done in a vacuum. That work is a part of a national call for police-free schools, an advancement project, and others at the national level have been supporting as a convener, as researchers, as like brilliant organizers and attorneys to help us at the local level figure out the best strategies and really understand the history of policing and school policing in this country. And so Maria is a dope organizer with Advancement Project. I will allow her to introduce herself beyond that, but really grateful to be in this work with her and that she was able to spend some time to talk to us today about the history of school policing in various ways that work is happening across the country. So Maria, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Samantha. Can everyone hear me? Perfect. So hi, everyone. My name is Maria Fernandez. I'm a senior campaign strategist at the Advancement Project National Office. So we're a national organization based here in DC. I'm a Ward 7 resident. My job essentially is to support youth organizing groups across the country in helping to develop and advance campaigns around ending the school to prison pipeline. And that specifically for us in this iteration means advancing and winning campaigns for police-free schools. So I am gonna share a little bit of our work with you all. Talk a little bit about how we landed on police-free schools, who are the folks that are organizing, what are they demanding, and then if there's a time for question and answer at the end, I'm excited to be in conversation with you all. I know this is an important committee that has an important responsibility, and I want to make sure that I can contribute to supporting you all in developing recommendations as much as I can. So I do have a presentation. I'm hoping that I can screen share. Oh,
I think you should be able to.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So I I'm gonna see if this works. I'm really bad with Zoom. I get really nervous. All right, so I'm gonna go. And let me know if I'm speaking too fast. I tend to do that. And I'm gonna, perfect. All right. So again, my work at Advancement Project is to specifically support young people across the country. So in addition to the amazing young people of Black Swan Academy, I get to support organizations and young people in New York, in Philadelphia, in Chicago, in Phoenix, in Miami, around these campaigns in Madison, Wisconsin, and have a team of incredible attorneys and organizers that are also supporting young people in other places across the country. So for Advancement Project, we are a national civil rights organization, celebrated our 20 years last year. And I've been at AP for about almost 5 years. And before that, come out of youth organizing work in New York, specifically as a former young person organizer working to end the school to prison pipeline in New York. So we get the honor to do this work around police-free schools, with the National Alliance for Educational Justice, which is the national youth organizing alliance of organizations across the country, both youth-led and intergenerational groups that came together, wow, almost a little bit over 10 years ago to do some federal and national work around the school to prison pipeline. That's a little bit about us. So I wanted to start this presentation today, kind of just centering who we know matters the most in this conversation around police out of schools and around policing and the criminalization of young people, which is young people. So I have a quote from Tamika, who's 14 and is here and is in DC. And for her, this is how she feels. So instead of maintaining a good environment for kids, they, police and schools, make us scared and escalate situations. Instead of making them feel safe, they are scared. Students spend so much time in school. We deserve to be comfortable and not afraid. So at Advancement Project, we put together a report that we dropped about 2 years ago, maybe a little bit over 2 years ago, specifically calling for police-free schools. This report is a culmination of years, of decades of organizing work in places like DC and across the country, led by Black young people, immigrant young people, queer and trans young people, who were really naming the phenomenon of the school to prison pipeline and putting forth and organizing recommendations to dismantle the school to prison pipeline. And for us, when we were writing this report, it was important to reframe the conversation and get to the root and the history of why police are in our schools. So we did a little digging, and through other research and other reports and in conversations with researchers and organizers, kind of created, did a timeline. We can send copies of the report your way. We can give you all the link to the report as well. We dropped it with an organizing action kit to help organizations start campaigns around police-free schools, start campaigns around ending the school to prison pipeline. So we dug deep a little bit about why police were in our schools in the first place, and generated 4 large assessments. So I'm gonna give y'all the 4 assessments that we have and back it with some historical context. So we understand that the school to prison pipeline as a delayed response by the state, so we're talking about local and federal agencies and government, to Black and brown student organizing. So we ground that on the rise of student protests in the 60s, in the demand in the South and then all over the country for rights for Black people in this country, and then specifically looked into the Philadelphia student walkout that happened in '67, and then the LA blowouts that happened in that same year. So in Philadelphia, thousands of young people, particularly Black youth, were marching out of schools and walking out to demand equitable, just education system, specifically around culturally relevant curriculum, so the demand to get Black studies in their classrooms, and the removal of police from their schools. Those young people were met with the force of the Philadelphia Police Department and Rizzo, who we know has been notorious around their policing practices. Similarly, the students in Los Angeles who have been mostly Chicano young people who were organizing to get similarly just quality education, who were also demanding ethnic studies, who were demanding literacy and a good quality education, organized a series of walk-ups now known as the LA Blowouts, and were infiltrated by the LA Police Department. So this is the kind of response that was happening. Oftentimes we like to say that the marshals escorted Black youth into schools in the South during integration and never left. So the second assessment for us around the history around school policing is that we believe that school policing is an extension of street policing. So how they treat particularly our communities, Black, brown communities, people in our communities, is how they're actually treating it in our schools. And we ground that through what we're calling through laws and policies that were passed on a federal level all the way to the local level. So we see this through the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, the '94 crime bill that funded and brought local police into our schools. So we see that again through all the history. And specifically, we point out the impact of the war on drugs and what it had for policing in our communities, and that actually came into our schools. The other assessment that we have is that as we started to organize and started to win shifts and changes in our education system, so the more that families organized to get an end to suspensions, or funding of restorative justice practice, or shifts and changes in discipline codes, we started to see districts specifically rely on police to handle school discipline. And that is what we're contributing to an increase in the presence and the role of police in our schools. So those are kind of the three assessments that we have around the history of policing. Again, we know that laws around police, programs that fund police like the COPS program continue to fund billions and billions of dollars into policing culture and infrastructure in our schools. And what we know is that the total investment made by state and federal governments for police officers in our schools since 1999 is close to $2 billion. So that's $2 billion that goes to policing that tangibly looks like police officers, police equipment, salaries. So all of the things that contribute to the criminalization of young people. And we dare to ask, what would $2 billion do differently if we wouldn't have invested that in restorative justice practitioners and programs in schools, into nurses in schools, into shifting the crumbling conditions in our schools, right? So it's about a question of budgets, and we like to think that budgets are moral documents. So what we fund is a reflection of our priorities. And then, you know, I feel like this data you probably all have seen before. So 1.6 million students attend school with school police, but no counselor. ACLU actually shifted the number a little bit, and I think they updated. So now we're saying that 1.7 students are in schools with police, but no counselor. We know that 3 million students are in schools with police, but no nurses. 6 million students across the country go to schools with police, but no psychologists. 10 million students in this country go to schools with police, but not social workers. So that's a combined of 14 million students in this country that go to school with police, but no counselor, no nurse, no psychologist, and no social worker. So I'm gonna let that land and share a quote from a young person, Michelle, who I got to meet as she was launching a campaign in Phoenix, Arizona, calling for cops out of campus. So to me, safety is walking into my school campus and not being watched by a police officer, waiting for me to make a mistake. Safety means having better counselors, having better supports to advance in my education. Safety means being welcomed and trusted. Safety means having input to decide what our schools can look like and feel like. And we know who are the young people that are going to these schools, right? So students of color are more likely to attend schools that employ school police officers, but no counselors. So specifically, Black students are 3 times more likely to attend a school with more security staff than mental health professionals. So wanted to share another quote from a young person from Miami. Last year, they were able to win an addition of more mental health professionals in school. So we wanted to share a little bit about what their vision for safety is. Instead of seeing police in schools, I rather see more teachers happy because they're getting paid more counselors helping with trauma, better buildings since my school doesn't have any windows, better books and technology, restorative justice, and better relationships. We don't have any of that. Putting more police officers isn't going to change the main problems in schools. It's just going to create more issues. We need a quality education, not handcuffs. So I share that because young people are clear with what generates safety for them. It's investment in resources and supports. It's staff who are happy and are equipped to handle and manage young people and be able to be in space with young people, right? It's being able to have their needs met fundamentally, to have restorative justice, to have books, to have windows that open. Miami is hot, right? So these are the things that young people are talking about that can mean safety for them instead of police. And I think, let me move this a little bit. There's also some data that we have, right? So while we believe that young people's stories are actual data, there's also some other things that we know to be true, right? So during the 2015-2016 school year, Black students made up 15% of the student population. This is nationally, but 31% of the students arrested and referred to law enforcement. So Black students continue to be disproportionately impacted by school policing and the school to prison pipeline. Black girls specifically make up only 17% of the public school enrollment across the country, but 43% of the girls arrested at school. And that students with disabilities represent only 12% of the student enrollment, but again, 28% of the students are referred to law enforcement or arrested at school. And there's no evidence to show that Black children, that young people of color behave differently than their white peers, but the response to Black young people in this country, specifically in our schools, is different. The response to them is to police and to criminalize. So what does this mean for DC? I think DC is actually very representative with the national data that we have around school discipline. So when police are in our schools here in DC, Black students are more likely to be arrested. So 92% of the school-based arrests in DC last year were of Black students, 92. And similarly to the national data around Black girls, here in DC, 60% of the girls arrested in DC are under the age of 15, and those are of Black girls. And that Black girls are represented at a rate of 30 times that of white girls and boys. And then I think, there's a question that right now feels a weird question around truancy and the use of police. But during the 2019-2020 school year, so the one that just happened, MPD picked up young people for truancy over 1,500 times. I wanted, I'm gonna, for this part, share a little bit about some of the data that we've been collecting around interactions with police officers in schools. And I will say, hopefully the video works, but I will say, I will put a trigger warning. You will see some violence done onto young people. So there is no national database that collects interactions with police or the violence done by police officers across the board. That means that there's no national data that tracks school police violence in schools. So we've taken up the charge. In 2015, I think everybody remembers the video of a young Black girl that was sitting at her desk who was flipped over from her desk and thrown across the classroom in Columbia, South Carolina. So that was Shakara. And everybody probably remembers that Shakara was arrested and that the young girl that recorded the assault, Nia Kenny, was also arrested. In South Carolina, disturbing education is a statute that gets you jail time or a $1,000 fine. So these two girls were charged with disturbing education. And we have labeled that assault, the assault at Spring Valley, and then did a series of work to start to document this level of police violence in our schools to be able to shift the narrative, the false narrative we believe that is that police are in our schools to protect young people. So I'm gonna show a video, so hopefully it works. We'll see. So at Advancement Project with the Alliance for Educational Justice, we have started to, as I mentioned, record it and have since the assault at Spring Valley recorded over 140 school police assaults. So we call them assault acts. And we say an assault act is any time a police officer hurts or harms a young person for any reason. And before the COVID pandemic, we were tracking, and when I say tracking, I mean like we're seeing articles, we're hearing stories from young people, we're seeing videos that are going on social media as it's happening, we're seeing lawsuits coming out, right? So that's kind of how we've been tracking it. And before COVID hit, we were at a rate about once a week. So once a week, a young person, particularly a young person of color, had been either body slammed, put on a chokehold, sexually assaulted, punched in the face, right, by a school police officer. And the way we got that is we literally counted all the assaults that we had for a school year and then divided that by the week, the average school week. So anywhere between 40 to 42 weeks. So we created a video and I'm just gonna play it. So let me know if you are here, don't have hearing.
I asked my daughter Naja because I could see the irritation that the children have. And I asked her to look at the police officer and tell me what she saw. And she stared at him for the longest time. And she looked at me and she said, "Mommy, he's a prick." And for a 19-year-old girl to be able to discern that a police officer in riot gear, standing arm in arm with a military, an army against children, the fact that they fear our children and that the children could discern that, it has stuck with me as one of the
growing up Black, especially Black in Milwaukee, we have a very negative connotation of the police. Like, you know, it's in our music and in our culture. Like, you see the police, you run out of the way. It's traumatizing because it's like, I remember going to this when I was younger. I happened to see my uncles, my cousins, but I would go visit them in prison. It's not, it's like, why am I going to this school?
I would feel safer if instead of police officers, we had more counselors or more teachers, more equipment. I don't come to school to get checked. I come to school to learn.
At an event at Benjamin Franklin, a boy, he wanted to use the bathroom, but he didn't have a hall pass. And so he threw an orange at the wall, but the opposite direction of a school police officer. But the school police officer claimed that he threw it at him. And after that, it resulted in him being like pinned down against the wall.
Yo, bro, you're not even resisting. Let him go, dog. You're not even resisting. He's not even resisting. Let him go, dog.
After that, we really fought to have less school police in our schools, more counselors, less defunding, because instead of school police officers, we should have climate managers that would be there when things start escalating, they can bring it back down instead of using excessive force and excessive violence.
Our vision for how we want young people to interact within the school environment is really looking at how do we shift what the power dynamics are between the school administrators and students. That means not just having young people talked about, but really making sure that the processes are driven based on what their feedback is. So if we want to talk about what improvements are happening in schools, there's viable opportunities for them to do that, and they're also seeing that reflected in the policy.
Using that and advocating for those who are unheard, those who maybe just don't want to advocate because they're scared, whether it's because they've been arrested before or because they're undocumented, and being the voice for those people, and also maybe one day working from the inside.
How do we ourselves define this word of safety, that for a lot of this perception of safety means enforcement or militarization or police, and a lot of times that's not the definition that comes from our own community and our own people.
Transformation! 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 Miracles! 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 I want it! 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 I got to have it. 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 Right now. 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 Right now.
So I'm gonna exit out of this and see if I could get back in. going to, all right. All right, so that's just a little bit about kind of the work that we've been doing in the organizations. And I think it's important to note that when we're saying school police assaults and why young people are getting assaulted by police in the cases that we've documented and tracked, and it's for things like wanting to use the restroom. I think you heard in the video of one of our members, Brian, who needed to use the restroom, and the bathrooms in his school at Ben Franklin were locked, and the person that had the key to the bathrooms was the school police officer. So anyone who needed to use the restroom had to first go to the cop to get the key to the bathroom, and the cop refused to let Brian into the restroom. And we know, right, like all the things that go with that about how are you going to tell someone who needs to go not to go, right? So young people are getting assaulted for wanting to use the restroom, for walking in the hallway without a pass, for being late to class, for refusing to leave when they get a suspension and they're like, no, I got to go to class. So these are the things what young people are being assaulted for. So then really quickly, because I think I'm running out of time, but we wanted to talk a little bit about what are young people actually demanding? If not police, then what? And the call that you have across the country, particularly Black youth, immigrant youth, brown youth, and undocumented young people, they're demanding police-free schools. And a year ago, we were all together in Baltimore, and we created a definition for what we want when we say police-free schools. And we're saying that we want schools that are dismantling school policing infrastructure, culture, and practice, so that it's not just about the physical cop in the school, right? But it's the culture of policing, the practice of policing that our young people face. It's ending school militarization and surveillance, and building a new liberatory education system. And for us, the fight for police-free schools is grounded in abolition. And I know that word, has a lot of feelings for a lot of people. But for us, really, we know that if we concede abolition or the removal of police from our schools, then we can believe that it's possible in our communities. And that for us, since we're students of abolition, we believe that it is a practical organizing tool and a long-term goal, that it's actually a practice about being in a radical imagination about something different than the current state of policing in this country, in the city, and in our schools. And we did a scan over the last several years. We've been building, I think folks are now hearing the words police-free schools for the first time after the uprisings this summer, and then the vote from the Minneapolis School Board to eliminate their contract. But we've been actually organizing for years and decades around ending the policing of our young people in schools. So organizations have been having campaigns, and we did a scan of what are the strategies that folks are deploying in their organizing, and came up with what we're calling the 6 Ds. So it's decriminalize. So decriminalize focuses on eliminating laws and statutes and school policies that criminalize students, like the disturbing education in South Carolina, right? But really all the infractions that criminalize young people and youth behavior. Where organizations are doing a deprioritize strategy that it's really intended to make the use of police officers in schools an instrument of last resort, if at all, right? The biggest one, and I think we're going to keep talking about it here, is the divestment investment strategy. So really identifying how much is spent on school policing and demanding that those resources be divested from police and invested in what we know works, right? And what young people and families have been demanding: counselors, social workers, health professionals, restorative justice programs, books, right? All these things. We also have a demilitarize/disarm strategy. So this came out of the fight in Los Angeles with the Labor Community Strategy Center, After Ferguson, it was very clear that cities across the country, and explicitly school districts across the country who were participating in the federal 1033 program. So that's military grade weapons that no longer was used by the many military arms of the United States and were given to local police departments. LA had a grenade launcher. The LA Unified School District Police had M16s, they had tanks, right? So young people waged a 2-year fight to get the district to return the weapons and apologize to young people. But specifically here, we're also calling for the end of surveillance technology that we're seeing and are concerned about as we're going on digital learning. A delegitimized strategy, so really focusing on the exposing the false narrative that we actually need policing in our schools to generate safety. And then a dismantle strategy, which is a combination of all the strategies that gets us to ending the relationship between school districts and police departments. For school districts that have their own police department, it means eliminating those departments and shrinking the powers of the police that the police have on our schools and in our young people. So again, we do these things with kind of 3 main goals. One, that it's about power shift. So shrinking the power of police have over Black youth, students of color, immigrant youth, gender non-conforming young people, queer and trans students, right? And then returning that power back to communities. So it's about community control. So we have a right to create real safety and determine what that safety for our communities and our schools look like. And lastly, it's about building a liberatory education system. The way we're doing schools, particularly in this moment of COVID and the years of impact that that's going to have on education, it's about, can we be bold and take risk and imagine education done differently? And can we have a school system that reflects the society that we want to create? And young people are winning. This is a combination of all the amazing actions that have been happening over the summer. So we're winning in places like Oakland, where the Black Organizing Project was able to get the school board to vote to eliminate the Oakland Unified School District Police, and are in the middle of a comprehensive implementation plan that's generated by community. And it's beautiful. After I do this presentation, I'm gonna send y'all the link to Bob's People's Plan for Police-Free Schools that highlights how to transition from police to no police. We're winning in Madison, where the school board president, who was a former police officer, put a resolution on there to end the contract with Madison Police Department. They too are in a fight for implementation to make sure that police-free schools is done well, and that the divestments that happen actually get reinvested into young people, particularly Black youth. We're winning in Denver with Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, who've been a juggernaut in this fight for 20 plus years to end the school to prison pipeline, who was actually the first to create an MOU that limited the role of police in schools, and have moved for the last several years to get cops out of schools. We're winning in San Francisco, in Phoenix, in Louisville, in Rochester, right, where the city council defunded the SRO program. We're winning in Milwaukee, where the school board, in addition to ending the contract, they voted to end all contracts with surveillance equipment that includes metal detectors. So now again, it's about implementation. In LA, the largest school police department in the country, right? The school board voted to defund the LA Unified School District by 35%. That's $25 million. In Chicago, they were in a fight for their lives this summer. Some of the most incredible organizing that I've seen from young people. While they were not able to eliminate the contract, which was a $33 million contract, they were able to get it defunded by $20 million, which is huge. And the city and the school district admitted that they have been putting young people in the gang database, right? So that was big because they've been denying that. And then we're seeing incredible fights in New York with the largest amount of police that they call school safety agents, over 50 to 100,000 cops in New York City schools. We're seeing fights in Philly, right here in DC, New Orleans, Miami, in the South, with, well, I know I said New Orleans and Miami, but I don't really think Miami is the South, but in places like Wake County, North Carolina, in Columbia, South Carolina, right? In honor of Naya and Shakara, every Black girl is still organizing to get cops out. In Charleston, in Providence, Rhode Island. And then we're international, so we're supporting campaigns in Ontario, a wide campaign around eliminating police from all levels of education, from K through higher ed. And more recently have been in relationship with folks in Manchester who just launched a campaign, Manchester in the UK, who just launched a campaign for no cops in schools. So we're growing in movement, and young people have had some of the most incredible victories around policing in this country has happened at the hands of young people. So what are young people demanding? This is specifically, I feel like y'all may have seen this, but if you haven't, these are the demands that Black Swan is leading here in DC, right? So it's the removal of police from DC public and charter schools. This was while the budget season was happening, right? There was a demand to reject the mayor's proposed $18.5 million increase in the school police budget that included a $2.5 million additional police in schools, investment in $6 million of the budget for school-based mental health programs, investment of $4.4 million to expand the use of community violence interrupters within schools and in community, and to train educators to practice social and emotional learning and transformative justice approaches. But these are very similar demands that young people have across the country. And I think really quickly, there's also some questions that folks have around police in schools that feel really hard to engage in, but very necessary, right? So there's a lot of myths about the use of police and whether or not they're effective. So there's a narrative, right, that police prevent school shootings. Oftentimes we say that, but actually we know that that is not statistically proven to be true, right? In fact, if we point to Parkland and the work with Power U in Miami, which is part of Dade County, which is adjacent to Broward County, where the Parkland school shooting happened, right? It's clear that there was a school police officer who ran the other way. And in fact, through a series of legal lawsuits, right, it became clear the judge ruled that the school police officer does not have a responsibility to actually protect the students. That was a ruling by a judge, right? And we know, I will drop it in the chat box later, but we've also done some work around this piece, right? Debunking the myths around school shootings. And we, along with the Alliance for Educational Justice, with the Dignities in Schools campaign and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, dropped a report after Newtown that said that actually police in schools is not the answer when a school shooting happens. So I can link that. That has a set of recommendations and some important language that we feel is really critical in this conversation. School police de-escalate dangerous and potentially violent situations. We know that oftentimes that isn't true because what we're seeing with our work with the collecting of data around school police assaults, we're seeing that oftentimes it is the police officer that escalates the situation that then becomes potentially dangerous. And police in schools make students feel safe. Time and time and time again, we're hearing from young people, specifically the young people that are a particular demographic, Black young people, immigrant young people, undocumented young people, queer young people, that they're saying that actually police do not make them feel safe. And when we ask them what makes them feel safe, it's everything but, right? It's caring adults, it's being able to have a meal, is being able to be welcomed into a school building, to be able to be in class, and that it doesn't, and we're not saying that young people don't respond differently or are capable of creating harm. What we're saying is that actually we have to have a fundamentally different response to young people than the one that we are having now, because we've enabled and further entrenched the school to prison pipeline in our communities by the responses that we've been having for the last several decades. I think that's all I have. Here's the national, with AP, with Black Swan Academy, with the Alliance for Educational Justice, is building a national campaign for the last several years, I've been building a national campaign for police-free schools. And here are all the organizations that are part of the national campaign across the country. And we're really excited that over the last several months, we've seen an increase in folks that are demanding the elimination of contracts, the elimination of local police, school police departments, and the big demand around reinvesting resources and funds into supporting the kind of education that young people are demanding. So I'll stop there. That took longer than I thought, so I apologize. But I do want to hear from you all. If y'all have any questions, if there's any concerns, I'll try my best to answer them. I will say that we are in a new stage of implementation. So folks are experimenting in their cities and places that they won the removal of police from schools. And if y'all need to talk to those folks, those organizations, folks have made themselves available to just chat about what they're doing with their school districts.
Thank you so much, Maria. I also offer, if you all have other questions that I could speak to in terms of DC, happy to share. But any questions for Maria?
Maria, I'm not sure if you would know this or not, but did you get a sense, like in your research, thank you for the presentation, by the way, first off, sorry about that. That was great, but I was curious if you have any knowledge of sort of when DCPS started, the NMPD started deploying school resource officers, or maybe Samantha, I don't know if you know that, but it's something that I searched for pretty extensively and just couldn't find any real information on.
So to my understanding, and others on the call, feel free to correct me, the creation of the school safety division, which right now is what held the security contract, as well as is responsible for the SROs and some of the special police officers within our schools, was created around 2005, 2004 in the aftermath of a shooting of a student of Ballou High School, outside of Ballou High School, and there was significant outrage in the community, and the response was to increase policing in those schools, as well as this feeling that security guards weren't prepared or didn't have the tools necessary to deal with that. Black Swan often talks about that as an example of how the state continues to use policing as a tool and as a Band-Aid to the overall issues and conditions that the under-resourcing of our schools and our communities cause. What we do know to be true in that specific case is that that was an instance of bullying that had been known, that had been recorded for months and months by the school, by the educators, and no intervention was made. And so again, we often see throughout the country, including here in DC, this response of policing, where there are so many other interventions that actually work and create safety that could have been, and that are cheaper, might I add, that could have been implemented far in advance of that.
Thank you for that.
And so, Samantha, I don't know if we'll have time in this call to do it, but does Black Swan have an analysis of DC, kind of like that national analysis of the things that went into that presentation of, police officers versus counselors and things like that, but then also some of the divest reinvest solutions to recommend?
We do. I can share quickly, and some of these numbers need to be updated, but the ones that we tend to look at are one, right now, I think it's for every 217 students, there is one social worker in DC schools. For every 400 students, there is one school psychologist. But for every 100, I think when you include school police officers and resource officers, for every 130 students, there are security personnel. And so again, we're seeing, right, the likelihood of young people interacting with police officers or security personnel because of adolescent behavior, because of responses to trauma, because of survival crime. We're seeing that they're going to be met with police officers and security guards far more often than they're met with the experts and resources that can actually support them.
Thank you for that. And then has Black Swan looked into, has Black Swan looked into some of the recommendations like this committee is tasked with working on? Like, do you have a, like, here's what we recommend based on the numbers, or is this committee, I mean, obviously the committee is looking at it, but I'm just wondering how far along are you with this work?
Yeah, we do, and some of those are what Maria shared at the end of her slides. I will say that even like a critique of our own recommendations around investments is it's not enough in terms of the dollars, right? Like they're looking at incremental change versus where we actually need to be for this vision of the liberatory education system. But we talk about increasing school-based mental health professionals for the social work, National Association for Social Workers, whatever that group is actually called, but something along those lines. The recommendation that is often floated around is they actually recommend for every 50 students, there should be one social worker, right? And again, we are for every 217 students, there is one social worker. And so we talk about school-based mental health professionals. We talk about violence interruption and creating a pipeline of violence interrupters who can resolve conflict, who can mediate within our schools and within our communities. And then we also just talk about equitable resources, knowing that a lot of reasons why police and security personnel are involved in our schools are for reasons that could be solved with more resources, for smaller classrooms, for more creative spaces for young people to go to if they're having a bad day, for healing spaces, for libraries, right, for more access to music and those types of things, for more quality teachers. And so we also look at that as well as looking at this invest divest strategy.
One thing, Samantha, I would throw out there is that I know in DC public schools there is a push because I have an agency that looks at trying to get Department of Behavioral Health, mental health care agencies in schools. So when we look at some of those numbers, I get it, but there is kind of a big push for each school to see if they could collaborate with some of these certified agencies in the city who actually have therapists, counselors, mental health care professionals to work with it. And then, of course, these people, like for my company, are not employed with DCPS, but are, are a certified agency with Department of Behavioral Health.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure if those numbers reflect that, but I do know that the DBH community partners are a part of that school-based mental health expansion model that every year we're like trying to get more money in, and every year is either not funded to scale or defunded. But I'm not sure if that number I presented earlier is reflective of the additional mental health professionals.
And that's why I brought that up too, because I'm not certain either, but I just some expert will be sitting out there and they'll say, well, so I just would throw that out there to you just a little bit. And if I can get some information, I'll get it to you as well on that, okay? Okay.
And another data point I would just mention really quick to Samantha's point, we talked about this actually in our budget report that the council wrote, was that the American School Counselor Association's recommendation is for one counselor for every 250 students, and DCPS currently has one counselor for every 408 students, as opposed to that recommendation. So,
could you say that one more time, Blaine?
Yeah, so they have, DCPS has a ratio of one counselor, one school counselor for every 408 students.
Okay.
The recommendation from the American School Counselors Association is one counselor for every 250 students.
Okay.
And Blaine, has the council looked at increasing that number?
I don't know a ton about what the education committee has done since that's not in my portfolio. I think there was some discussion about it. but I couldn't tell you exactly what that is. There might be people who have a better understanding of that than I do at this moment.
Hey, Blaine?
Yeah.
Can we run the data with respect to, number of police officers or resource officers that are in the schools compared to, the number of students, and on a school by school basis, from the high schools to middle schools to elementary schools, and then and then the overall cost of having police officers in schools, and the cost of all of the counselors, mental health professionals, and then take the national data and determine what that budget would look like if we were to have a recommendation that would align with, the National Nurses Association or the National Counselors Association.
Yeah, I mean, so I can tell you
from a budgetary standpoint, they would be able to, there's a lot of data, and having worked on a gazillion budgets, I just like to see the numbers and the analysis around it to make the case for increasing. And then also the number of students of color, the demographics of the students. And then if you take an analysis of, if you do every school within the districts, let's say in wards by ward, what are the number of students of the demographics of those students, and then the number of counselors, nurses, social workers on a school by school, ward by ward, so that we know whether or not there are gaps, and then we can take all of those numbers and then put them in a document that makes an apples to apples, to the extent possible, comparison.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just as a brief sort of overview, and I'll definitely get some more data, but the school security contract currently is around $22 million, is my understanding. And there are about 330 security officers in DCPS schools. And I believe there are, I can't remember exactly how many. I want to say it's close to like 90 school resource officers, although I could be off on that. The school resource officers are a little different in that they do like a cluster beat model, which I had sent in the paper I talked about earlier, but they're still deployed to schools in situations where there's maybe circumstances where somebody supposedly has to be arrested, things like that. So Samantha, sorry, I didn't.
Those numbers are pretty on point. I think the security contract is for up to 400 security guards, and then there are about $11 million that we are spending on school resource officers specifically, and sometimes special police officers, which are a bit different but pretty much the same. And then DCPS also has a small budget for special police officers as well.
Yeah, if we have all of that data, so we can, we can put it in a document that shows, and then there's a budget that's coming up in 2022, I think. And so if there's a budget issue, then we need to be able to embed the budget as part of our recommendations in terms of wherever we land with respect to those recommendations. And I agree with Samantha with respect to the history, because I was on the scene when that event happened at Ballou High School. And then there was this reaction that we should have more police officers in school, that the security contract at the time was not sufficient to police the schools. And then I think back to Ms. Fernandez's presentation, which I think was a very powerful presentation globally, which gives us a very good analysis of what's done nationally. I know I have a meeting with some folks in Oakland on Friday, and so I am going to do some further inquiries into Oakland. And then if I may ask Ms. Fernandez a question, do we have, once I would suppose that there's not yet enough data to show what the results are at this point. It's a little bit, it seems like it's a little too early to, just based on your presentation, to determine whether or not those decisions that were made this year, the impact of those decisions yet, right? When we remove the police officers from those schools. But I don't think that should be a marker, as it were, for not going forward, just because all of the data is not there yet. So let's be careful not to fall into, someone can come back and say, well, you've removed them, but what has been the results? I just think the results are a little bit too early. It doesn't mean that you don't go forward, right?
Absolutely. I think, and groups are in various different stages. So I think Oakland is probably the most sophisticated in terms of implementation, the thinking about it, the questions around different roles, the way community engage. So definitely we'll look into that. And I thought there was a chat function, but there isn't. So I can email out Oakland's People's Plan for Police-Free Schools. I can also email out the report around school shootings. And, I think you're right, we don't have any data around it working, but I know two things for sure. I know we have enough data that shows that it doesn't work. And, oh, damn it, I had another thing. It was a good point too. Yeah, so we have enough data that it isn't working.
And that's a good thing. I just don't want, those who will come back and say, as someone who deals with numbers and all kinds of crazy analysis, I don't want someone to come back and say, well, it's too early, therefore we should continue with what we have, right?
For sure. I got my second point. Sorry. And what we do know is that what we also don't want is for districts to jump in and do something and then not fund it well or implement it well. And then there'll be a justification for saying, hey, it didn't work. Actually, you have to invest and you have to fund the programs, the strategies, all the things, right? Because then that's going to be what indicates that it's working. But if y'all move something and there's no money to back it or no interest or willing to make it successful, then of course it will fail.
What I was going to say is that there's there's an organization in the city that is made up of, it's called SHAPE. And they are also a part of the 21st Century School Fund down on 12th Street in the Thurgood Marshall Building. And they've been paying attention to this, and it's a high school level organization made up of parents, principals, and the whole 9 yards. They were around when all of that got started back in 2004, 2005. And DCPS hands are really dirty in all of this, really. And they had a lot to do with pushing what it was that they wanted and this whole idea about putting police in the schools. But what I was going to say was that there are some programs, there's some cities rather, who have, or I should say, school systems that have not only put out the police, but they have also reimagined the security people, and they're doing a very different job. And they do have some data to talk about what's going on, how they're working with it. This one district that we looked at reimagined the security guards to be people who work with the students in the school, and it's a school that had some student behavioral issues, and they have been showing success. They've been doing it now for some time. And so I would think that maybe the people from SHAPE and the 21st Century School Fund could talk about the history, because everybody wasn't on the same page when it came to wanting police in the schools. As a matter of fact, there were people in the police department that didn't want it either, that didn't even want police in the schools. And that was coming from, DCPS was pushing for that. And lastly, I would say, I work in a couple of 3 schools in Ward 4. And I want to tell you, one of them is the elementary school. I have 2 elementary schools and 1 education campus. That equation that that Blaine talked about, that DCPS uses for social workers and counselors, isn't necessarily true across the board. It's not, because in my schools we have, for example, like Truesdale has a little over 400 students, not quite 500, and they have way more than 1 social worker, way more than 1 counselor, and that gets decided. The principal and the people at the school get to decide that they can use the budget to determine who they want in there. So I know that there are times that they have had up to 3 social workers in the school. They have even had counselors, 2 or 3 counselors that's in the school. And like I said, the student body isn't over 500. So each school is different. But I said Truesdale is an elementary school. It's now an elementary school. It was an education campus. So, and there are other schools in Ward 4 that have more, around the same 400, 500 students, and they have more than 1 social worker. They have more than 1 counselor. And the decision is made by the principal when it comes to budget time, what they want and what they're going to do and who's going to be in there. So it's going to be different across the board. Now, I can't tell you if that's the case with middle school or high schools, but in elementary schools, they have more. They have more than 1 counselor and more than 1 social worker. Now, I ain't arguing for or against either one. I'm just telling you that that's the makeup of the school. So if you're going to look at it, you're going to have to look at it individually.
I would, if I may jump in, I would agree with you. Therefore, our commission shouldn't back off and just say this is what the national data shows. I mean, that's right. That's one test.
Right.
But then we should say we should look at the demographics for each school.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, I think we're talking about serving children if we're moving the police out, right? So we're talking about implementing those things that Ms. Fernandez talked about, that Samantha talked about, in providing the social workers, the school counselors, all of those, you know, on a school by school, because children come to these, you know, having run a school district of 100,000 students, it's you know, you learn quickly that many students from different parts of the community bring different issues and concerns into those schools and require different types of intervention. And the intervention is not someone with a badge and a gun and that sort of thing. So those are the things that we, you know, we have to look at. And I would like for us, Christy, you know, as we get our commission, is to really try and have an impact on how things are funded in the next year's budget. And then my final question, and perhaps the Samantha or Ms. Fernandez can answer this question. What happens when, you know, I've seen this many times, an issue occurred in a neighborhood, you know, where there's a beef, right? And then it plays itself out on the school campus or in the schoolhouse. So at that point, you know, you're gonna need some law enforcement. And I think too, we need to consider, you know, what is the training of those law enforcement officers who will be, well, I guess you can't, Ron's been a police officer, I guess you can't make that decision, but I think we have to, you know, there are times when the issues play themselves out in the community over a weekend and then they play themselves out on the school campus. And so maybe that's the case where we have the violence interrupters, right? That's where those individuals come into play, because they would know from what's happening in the community and then have some idea of how it may play itself out, and then there could be an intervention before the issue gets on the school campus. Not 100%, but that's the ultimate that we're trying to get to.
Yeah, And I just say just really quick that Ron makes an important point that the ratio data doesn't really, obviously it's sort of a high level thing. So when you think about like the ratio of one psychologist for every 400 students, what you're not hearing is that only a third of all DCPS schools have a full-time mental health psychologist on staff.
Right.
And so those are things that we definitely need to dig into. So.
And Blaine, if it would also be possible to, sorry, I was just going to ask, if it would also be possible to let us know who makes those decisions, because I think that would sort of factor into kind of what we look at and how. Thank you.
Yeah. Yep.
I will say really quickly that I think the who and the demographics are important, because what you'll probably notice is that you'll see a disproportionate rate of who are the young people that have some of these things in their schools and who aren't. So I feel like that's absolutely important, and leading with a racial justice analysis is key. And then I think your question around conflict that happens in community, right? Like, yeah, we absolutely understand that these things happen in our neighborhoods, and that they can come into our classrooms. And we like to believe that the minute a young person picks up a weapon, whatever it is, it was already too late. And there were a series of interventions that could have happened before that young person got there. And I think we often think about community schools as disconnected from community, but schools are deeply part of our community. So when we think about a holistic approach to addressing harm when it's done in our communities, it has, in our schools, it has to include community as well. So I think the violence interruption is key. I think conversations around what is first response to these things, what are mentorship programs that can happen of people in community feels really important. And what I will say is that I think we have to start thinking about police, not just like the individual cop, but as a system, right? And kind of thinking we gotta break from this system and actually talk about what are the things and who are the people in our communities that can help generate safety. And oftentimes those are the people that will have the biggest relationships with young people.
AK, I think I saw you, and then Christy.
Thanks, Blaine. I just wanted to know for clarification, maybe this is for Samantha or Ms. Fernandez, when you're talking about the 325 school security officers or the 98 SROs, that's not actually even including the officers who might respond to calls from schools, right? So there might be even, plenty more officers who are actually being called from the school to respond. Okay, and then my other question was, again, for either of you, if you know whether MPD and specifically the officers who are responding either to calls from the school or who are SROs participate in the 1033 program that you mentioned, where the LA school officers had I think you said grenade launchers or other things. Do we know if our school officers have access to those kinds of weapons as well?
I don't think DC, the city, participates. I could figure it out. But what the LA piece was that the actual school district got it because they have their own police department in the school. So if y'all don't have your own police department, so but it doesn't mean, right, like we should assume that in a place that has all the policing jurisdictions that it does, like DC is wild in the number of policing agencies and the jurisdictions that they have. But I haven't seen, Sam, I don't know if you have, around the militarized weapons or equipment in DCPS.
I don't think it's the same as LA. I'm familiar with the LA Police Department, and Darrell Gates, who was a former police officer, chief of police there, had all of the military types of things going on with his police agencies, and it played itself out not only with the school district's police, but LA County, the whole. So it was somewhat of a different world, but I don't think that's the same for the DC Police Department. I'm making that statement, however, we should confirm as well.
Thanks, Bob. And sorry, one last question, and then I know, Christy, totally, it's up to you. But I was wondering if the research that the Advancement Project did, like the arrests of students, does that include students who maybe were arrested not on school property, but at home or in the community, but based on something that happened in school?
For the most part, all of the student-based arrests are school-based. but there is the referral to law enforcement. That doesn't necessarily, that if like if a fight happened or something happened, they will call and refer the young person to, yeah. So that is it's broader than the school-based arrest, but for most data, it's school-based arrest. Yeah, when the Office of Civil Rights released their data collection, it's not the best data. So I never tell people to go do OCR data at all because it's always so old. But there were so many issues with the data, like they weren't, depending on how policing happens in your city or your school district. In a place like New York, because it was the NYPD school safety division, so those are sworn law enforcement officers that belong to the NYPD that get assigned to be in schools, because they were arresting it and the federal government was requesting data from the school district. The school district was like, we don't have any arrest data, and they took that as there were no arrests in New York City, like the first year the OCR data came. So yeah, I would, for the most part, it's school-based arrests, but the referrals to law enforcement is a little bit broader.
I'll just add, in DC, for DC specifically, what we found even this past year, so the past school year that included COVID, there were a little under 70 school-based arrests in DC. 23 of those school-based arrests were made at one high school. So that tells you something there. And we know overall with that, the most, for both last year as well as just in general, the number one reason for what we are calling school-based arrests was simple assault, so fights. And then the second reason though, which is alarming to me, was for release violations or fugitive arrests, were the most prevalent. And so that's right, like a kid being arrested at school, either for an arrest warrant or like pre-petition custody order for leaving home or missing a court date. And so those are still classified for school-based arrests, even though they weren't like a school-related offense. And that is actually the second most prevalent reason for young people getting arrested, which adds into the overall point around, right, presence of school police and policing young people leads to school push out and drop out and like the school to prison pipeline. If I can get arrested when going to school for a non-school related offense, then I'm just not going to come to school. And so we're seeing that happen time and time again.
Sorry, this is Emily. I had a question about that data that I just want to make sure I understand it. So certainly I understand that the data includes things that happen at school and folks who are arrested at school for something that happened outside of school. I'm trying to figure out how to break those down. Is it clear in the data, for example, if somebody's arrested for an assault, it's theoretically possible, it seems to me, that that assault was committed someplace else and a warrant was issued or whatever, and they were arrested for, so, but I'm sorry, I know I'm being unarticulate. Do we know which is which just by looking at the data, or do we have to make some assumptions based on certainly the ones that are fugitive warrants are arrests for on warrants or whatever, but even for the rest of them, it seems to me that it'd be hard to break down what's happening at school and what's not?
That is a good question. I will say that when given the data, I haven't seen the raw data, so I'm not sure. When reported out, they did not make the distinction. So that would be something that we need to look into.
Thank you.
A question. Well, actually, I first had a question, big question and small question. My small question is about the security guard budget, the $20 million budget. It seems to me that for security officers, especially if there's already SROs and special police officers, the security officers are acting an awful lot like police officers. And it's not clear to me whether the police-free schools demand from Black Swan also asks to disband the security officers, or I can see it saying, no, let's just make sure they act like security officers and maybe, I don't know, patrol parking lots to make sure cars don't get broken in. So I want a little bit of clarity about what they do, because the training makes it seem like they do more than we think security officers do, and what the demand is. And then I have a bigger question, which is, so I think the push out issues and the criminalizing, just like the bringing the criminalizing school discipline, that's a huge reason and a huge, reason to be concerned about police in schools. But it seems in DC, there's another really compelling reason, which is that a lot of the violence that we see involves school-age youth or youth in schools, and it clearly isn't working to have police in the schools to bring that down. And obviously part of the answer is more counselors, more mental health support, more social workers to build up those services. But it does really seem like a violence interruption model would be really appropriate. I mean, you might as well try it because what we're doing now isn't working, right? So I'm wondering if there's been any analysis of what it would take, how you would do that, what people think it would take to, I know we went from 2 to 4 violence and Cure the Streets spots in DC recently. Like, has anyone looked at what that would take to do that same thing in the schools?
We haven't yet. Violence interruption is a part of our demands, and having models that are school-based. One of the things that we have started to imagine around is, and Maria, feel free to jump in if I'm not articulating this clearly, is when we're thinking about reimagining the security guards, is what if those 400 security guards were actually, and maybe not the same individuals, but if the thinking was that we will actually train and arm those types of security personnel as violence interrupters who can meet things early on in advance, who can mediate, resolve conflict, de-escalate, and build healthy social emotional relationships with the young people.
Can I just add one more thing I meant to say, which is that it seems to me, based on things that a number of people have said, that there's 2 important groups that we need to be talking to and hearing from. One is the teachers. It sounds like they were a big part about, or in the administrators, pulling the police into schools. My experience has been that a lot of that, I have no idea what is in DC, but there might need to be some listening and some education about, like, it's not that we're saying there will be no attention to these issues in the schools, and just trying to, I don't know how much of that has been done, so I'd be interested to hear about that, but it seems like that could be something that our commission might be helpful with. And also the police department, MPD, I heard Ron say that many people in MPD didn't want to go into the schools. It would be interesting to hear those different perspectives on what their views are. I think it's essential to hear those perspectives and what their views are, because those are going to be if for no other reason. I want to hear from them because I think they'll have valuable insights, but also just as a strategy, from a strategy perspective, those are going to be very powerful voices in this conversation. It would be useful to know what their concerns are and what parts of this they could support.
I'd also like to understand, and Samantha, maybe from having done this work so intensely in the city, you know the answer to this. To what extent is pressure to have police in schools coming from the parents? And is there more education that needs to be done there, or are the parents on board, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, so I will say youth, parents, educators, regardless of the stakeholders, right? When we talk about policing in this country, this is a part of the way that we've been conditioned to think about this country. And so off the bat, there are going to be Black young people, Black parents, Black educators who in the same breath will say police do not keep us safe, and then when asked what they need for safety, they'll say police. And the reason is really because we have not been given the space or the freedom to dream and to reimagine what those alternatives are, even though marginalized communities have been keeping ourselves safe right since the beginning of time. And so to give space for those conversations to not be, do you want police or not, but what feels safe to you? What are the resources, the investments that you actually need to be safe without police? And so really being clear up front that we're talking about dreaming up a world without police, dreaming up schools without police, and kind of setting that as the starting point to get people to think about, well, when I say I want police, what I really mean is I want conflict resolution. Okay, who can give conflict resolution? What I really mean is I need crisis intervention. Okay, who can give crisis intervention? And so on and so forth. All those really intricate and particular aspects of safety that we have only been taught to equate to police, even though we also know that's not true. So yes, to be clear, parents are definitely calling for police. Educators have definitely called for police and more police. But I have found that when given that space and when doing some of that education, but more so giving the space for people to dream, it becomes clear within a conversation that there are alternatives that young people, parents, and educators alike prefer over police. Maria, I don't know if you have other thoughts or context around that.
No, I think that's great. That's like actually it, right? Like parents as the parents are not a monolith, as young people aren't a monolith. I will say on the teacher union or the teachers conversation that there has been unions who have literally put their bodies on the line with young people to get police out of schools, right? So we saw CTU, the Chicago Teachers Union, their Latinx caucus, really so strong and took leadership from young people, organized, and were demanding cops out of schools. They demanded the reduction of police and the investment in supports as part of their teacher strike that they had last year. So they've been working at it and really taking the leadership of community. And then the Oakland Education Association really came in and supported the work of the Black Organizing Project and talking about union and labor and how labor has to support the organizing. So I think it depends. And just like you'll find teachers that say, yes, I want police, you will also find teachers that say, I want something different. I want a different tool in the classroom that's not calling this cop, because I want this kid in the classroom and they deserve an education. Help me figure this out.
I know that we're running short on time, but I think we also have to listen to the parents as well. We need to hear all voices. I'll come back. I want to get rid of this, but
I think
one of the comments that Samantha made was very powerful, and that is the number of arrests of students on campus for violations off campus by cops coming into the schools. And I think that's something we should look at.
I think too, we look at too, you talk about the security contract. And again, I emphasize that I think they have some relationship in the schools with behavioral healthcare agencies. So I think that I think I understand the bonds interrupters. We also have to get the data about the how many from the Department of Behavioral Health individuals are in those schools, because those are not counted in those numbers that I think we're giving out today. But I could be wrong, but I just don't think they are. But also, so when you have a comprehensive data, but I also think too, as you listen to parents, listen to educators, you might have to listen to some people who are involved in that contract with security. Find out again, I think we have information on their training, but also what is their day-to-day like, man? What are they just locking people up and putting them away, but what do they actually do also to help keep young people in school, things of that nature? I think you have to bring them to the table as we look at, everybody involved in the life of that young person.
Absolutely. I'll share that we have been in conversation while Black Swan Academy pushes and supports the work of young people. We have been in conversation and in coalition with educators, including the Washington Teachers Union, including SHAPE. We have been in conversation with parents and administrators, as well as SEIU, who is the union of the security guards. And so this is a demand, like Maria said, while there are people who will still name police as the equation of safety, there are certainly people from all of those groups who are calling for police-free schools. Christy asked a question earlier about security guards. And so for Black Swan Academy, we are talking about the divestment of all forms of policing and criminalization, including security guards. What we do acknowledge, however, is that the problem with security guards is largely the role of security guards. So security guards are the ones who are stopping and frisking young people every single morning in the metal detectors. Security guards are the ones who are patrolling the hallways and being forced to tell young people, right, to go back in class where young people want to use the bathroom or when young people need a break and don't have an alternative room or place to go to for that escape. Security guards are the ones who are working closely, tend to be the ones who are working most closely with the police officers. And so when we're talking about a complete removal of police officers and special police officers from schools, we are also demanding that reimagination of that position completely, so that those security, which includes, right, the removal of metal detectors and the surveillance and all of that equipment, but it also includes who reimagining what our frontline staff and personnel are, so that if we are spending education dollars, which we are for that contract, if we're spending education dollars, that every single person who is in that building that we're spending $23 million on is responsible for having a role in creating climate.
And I will say that I think, you know, to be clear, just in case there's still some questions, we don't actually think that because the National Association of School Resource Officers will have you believe that a cop can be a counselor, that a cop can be a social worker, that a cop can be a mentor. And we want to disrupt that narrative because they have done trainings across the country and behavior isn't changing, right? Like when I was 15, we were organizing and we trained cops in New York who were in schools, right? Like we've done it all and still it hasn't shifted because it's a structural problem, right? It's a systemic issue. So when we're saying we want counselors, social workers, violence interrupters, we're not saying make a cop into those things. We're actually saying hire those who that is their profession. Hire social workers who went to school, who are trained, who practice social work, right? So I think just wanted to be clear.
Yeah, and I think also, I think it's important to, even if there are some SROs who are perfectly fine as counselors, or you could train them theoretically, I think it's part of the unhealthy normalization of policing to I don't know that we want children getting used to having a police officer as their counselor or their social worker. Even if we, you know, fully believe in police and you want your people to trust police, that's not the same as saying a police officer is your counselor. And I think we just need to, you know, that is part of the narrative we need to disrupt. In my view, that it's not normal to have this state function serve this variety of roles in individuals' lives.
I want to be mindful of time since I know we're actually a little bit over. Did anybody else have any other questions or comments? Just so people are aware, a couple folks, including Kelly O'Meara of MPD, have been posting in the Q&A. Just some clarification. So for folks who haven't checked it out yet, please do. And I'll make sure that those comments are passed on if you haven't had a chance to look at them.
Go ahead.
That's me, Sam. I was just going to say, before we go, if we can just talk about process for next meeting, because there's obviously a lot we could talk about, like whether it's scheduling or just to get a sense of when we're going to reconvene.
Before that sounds like really important business. And I just want to thank y'all so much for having us on. And if we could be a resource to this commission and the subcommittee, please let us know. Sam, you got our information. I will send Sam all the resources that I mentioned for you all, but thank you so much.
You did a great job.
Thank you so much.
Maria.
Thanks for joining.
Good evening.
And Maria, before you jump off, I was going to make a statement before we did that, just to be clear, because a couple people have brought this up. I want to be clear that while Black Swan Academy is pushing a divest invest strategy and calling for the removal of police from schools, that until we remove police from our communities, there are still going to be ways that young people encounter police officers. And it's important, a couple people brought that up, it's important that we're intentional about some of those other strategies that Advancement Project named, like the disarming and the demilitarization. I see they mentioned that school resource officers do not have access to militarized equipment, but other police agencies within DC do, right? And so like, what does that mean when we're talking about policing youth outside of school, or if MPD were to show up at school, even though there's not a school safety division, what does that mean? And so for us just to be intentional and mindful of that, those other strategies that Maria mentioned earlier, for us to think about once we remove police from schools, all those other things that we have to be thoughtful about doing as well. Was that right? Yep. Okay, cool.
Have a good
Thank you, Maria. All right, so Sultan, you said talking about sort of next meeting, next steps.
Yes, that'd be great.
So what are folks thinking? I don't know if we have any set time or dates for future meetings or what that sort of would look like.
Happy to send out a when to meet.
Just the other committee I'm on is doing like a bi-weekly schedule. I don't know if you all were thinking in terms of the regularity with which this committee wanted to meet, if bi-weekly sounded good, or especially Samantha and LaShonda, if you had a different suggestion.
So the committee that Sultan and LaShonda chair meets at this time, and I think we're doing and a lot of us are actually on that committee. I think we said we were gonna do weekly, like we were gonna kind of hold it weekly, and then the event that we didn't need to meet, then we wouldn't meet. That feels better to me.
And I would even say, and LaShonda, let me know, or anybody else who's on that committee, I think there's some stuff that committee is waiting on. And so if this committee even wanted to kind of like take this upcoming Monday, because I think there's a lot that we could talk about, like really deep diving into policing in schools in DC and what that looks like. And I think there's way more that this committee is ready to talk about than that other committee. So I would even kind of like free up next Monday if this committee wanted to reconvene on Monday.
I would love to reconvene on Monday or next week. I would love to kind of digest this together a bit more sooner than later.
Blaine, are the commission meetings, the full commission meetings on Mondays?
Let me check. I don't remember off the top of my head. I think, yeah, the full commission. So the full commission meeting in October is on the 19th. And then in November, it's on the 16th.
So just FYI, that's one Monday a month.
If we can't make a decision right now, I'm happy to do a when to meet as soon as we get off this call, in hopes that we finalize it before the end of this week.
Yeah, so I would recommend that perhaps we focus on scheduling the next meeting. So, Samantha can send out the when to meet and we can see where people are in terms of the general cadence of the meeting moving forward, whether or not we want it to be every single week up until a certain point, or if a bi-weekly meeting, it just fits better with other subcommittees with the larger commission meeting time. Because at a certain point, all the evenings are going to be occupied. And I don't think it's actually a good idea to take another committee's time, because I think that we should kind of just focus on maybe just setting up the next meeting. And then from there, we can see what our cadence can be based upon all the other schedules. Also, Blaine, is there any way to maybe create an actual like just general commission calendar where we can see where all of the subcommittees in addition to the larger commission meetings are calendared and what their cadence is? So like, for example, you mentioned one of the subcommittees that's meeting bi-weekly, they already sort of set up their times. Could we create some sort of shared document where we could just all see when other
I've been working on a commission calendar that's associated with the email address that we have for the commission. So I have most of the stuff on there. I need to get a few more things on there, and then I'll share it with all of you so that way you have an idea of where everything's at.
And of course, folks like us are still trying to figure it out. So I understand that, yeah. But that might be helpful in just planning forward for this particular committee, since other committees already have seemingly solidified their calendar already.
All right, in terms of next steps, was there anything else that we wanted to discuss, or?
I offered, I'm not sure if it was to this full committee, or to those who had mentioned wanting to be chair, that we extend an invitation to Professor Kristen Henney of Georgetown, who is in the process of releasing a book entitled Arrested Development, From Emmett Till to Tamir Rice. Talks about police and criminalization of youth. She in particular, I think, has deep knowledge, obviously, around police and criminalization of youth, but can talk about the trauma of policing and the normalization of policing and what that impact has on young people, both from the school system to the juvenile justice system. So she has a wealth of knowledge, and I would love to invite her in as a speaker, but wanted to get thoughts, one, if you all were okay with that, and two, if I should hold off, if it should not be this next meeting, but hold off maybe for later.
Can I say, oh, I'm sorry, Dalton, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that sounds great for the next meeting. I would love and appreciate like a deep dive into DC, like the differences between the police and the security officers, who makes the decisions, how much money is being spent. So we have a clearer picture of what we're looking at as we sort of factor in some of the things that these other speakers are talking about.
Yeah, I was just gonna, that makes sense to me. I was gonna say, Chris's work is in DC, so she has that, although her book is much broader, she has that expertise. Because it deals not just with youth in schools, but also youth on the streets, I think it touches on a number of different committees, and I would suggest that she come speak to the entire commission because of that. And I'm not sure exactly how that would work, but I think a number of committees would benefit from that. And I do think that we should hear from, I don't know how the committee wants to do this, but hear from some teachers or parents and MPD on the school issues to make sure that we get those perspectives and build them into the thinking here as well.
Can we also hear from DCPS? Because we haven't, we haven't talked about, they're responsible for all of this. What role have they played in it? Because their hands are dirty in this whole process. It's not that they're standing on the side and all of this stuff has been forced on them. So if you had a room of 20 principals, and you asked them, do they want police in their schools or not? All 20 of them would say they want police in their school. Yet, the majority of situations that principals have when they call or get the police involved, they're administrative matters. They are not matters where the police get involved in it. And so their hands are, they are complicit in this process. And at some point, we need to hear from them about about their role in it, as well as what we were talking about earlier, about what is their plan in terms of reimagining the role of people who used to be security guards.
Ron, can I ask you, when you're saying DCPS, are you specifically talking about principals, or are you thinking about people in central office, or both?
No, well, I think first of all, it has to be somebody from central office, because each principal is going to talk about their own reason for having them. But I want to know what DCPS thinks about it, not the individual principal. Yeah.
So
I think too.
So one of the things that I think, just in terms of, I'm just trying to be mindful of time and next steps, is that one of the things that I recommend is that perhaps Samantha, you and I can get together and based upon all of the feedback that we've gotten, so teachers, families, DCPS, potentially Professor Hennings, for everyone, is just to put together a list of all of the different people that people have mentioned that they, or entities that they want to bring in to talk to, and propose an order based upon the conversation today that the committee can respond to, so that we can kind of, one, it'll help with calendaring future meetings and how frequently we want to meet moving forward, but also to take in people's feedback and then just say, next meeting could be this, and then it builds towards this second one, and thinking about it like that. And then send it back out to the subcommittee for people to look at, respond to, and also add any additional agencies or programs or experts that they want to be able to hear from.
I think too that we should hear from the police as well. In particular, I mean, they certainly have a perspective, and we need to know what that perspective is. And it's not that their perspective will change hearts, souls, and minds, but we should hear from the police as well. I mean, they're and the challenges that they face going into either working in schools, the training of their officers. And I think the city council has already made a decision that the police will no longer be in the schools, but we should at least hear from the police department as well.
All right, any other, I think what I heard from LaShunda was that it might be good for her and Samantha to connect and sort of map out what people are sort of giving us in terms of what they want to hear from and what that looks like for our future meetings. Is there anything else in terms of order of business that we need to talk about before we depart? I want to be mindful of time. It is 8:01. Hearing none, then I would say we're adjourned. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate all your participation, and thank you, Samantha, for lining up the advancement project. Really appreciate it.
Good job, Samantha. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.